Welcome to episode 85 of Live with the Maverick. My name is Dominic Lee, founder of Maverick Actuary. We are a content community. Our mission is to maximize the impact and value of quant professionals on a global scale. The goal of this series is to educate our community on the most relevant themes in actuarial science, risk management, and analytics. The theme of today's discussion is Career Progression Part 2. And we are very excited to have with us our guest, 𝗘𝗽𝗏𝗃𝗲. Kellen is an executive vice president and global insurance executive. So welcome, Kellen.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Thanks for having me.
Great. Just love to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I appreciate it. As you said, my name's 𝗘𝗽𝗏𝗃𝗲. I've been in the industry for 15 years, worked for a couple companies. It's been a fantastic industry, a fantastic ride. Let me say just before I jump in, I'm very excited to speak with you. Quick disclaimer, any views I express are my own opinions, in no way speaking on behalf of a current employer. And now that we have that piece out of the way, let me just say thank you for having me. This is a topic I'm very passionate about. Received a lot of, I would say, lucky, fortunate advice early in my career related to this topic and hoping to pass that forward if it's helpful. And let me also say, I love what you're doing and the community you're doing it with. I've had the privilege of working with some incredible actuaries the last 15 years. The value they bring, the way they think, I love it. And we'll talk about this more, but most of my early mentors or sponsors were actuaries. So hopefully in some small way I can pay it forward on their behalf as well.
Which is interesting because even though we had several interactions at a prior company, in preparation for this interview, I learned that as well. I never realized that so many of your mentors were actually actuaries. So that was interesting to me as well.
When you seek out people who are smarter than you, I think a place you often go is actuarial science. So maybe that explains it.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, one thing I wanted to set the premise or the tone for the episode. In previous conversations that we've had, Kellen, of course, has had an exemplary career through commitment, focused application, building relationships, and other things. But just want to clarify that the spirit of this episode is we're not trying to replicate Kellen's career. I think it's just what we want to do is talk about some important considerations and things to think through just to help people get the most out of their individual careers, acknowledging that no two careers are the same. So would that be a fair assessment, Kellen?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is not about me. It's about, exactly as you said, passing it forward and helping people think about how you construct a career and how you take agency over it and leverage the power of those around you. So very fair.
Excellent. So I did mention the theme career progression is the theme for today's discussion. But let's take a step back. How do you think about your career when you started out?
Well, when I started out, I had graduated into the teeth of a global recession. I had been conditioned that the way you thought about a career was go to school, study, work hard, get a job, pay off your student loans. And so on all of those counts, I felt a bit surprised and behind. I graduated in the spring of 2009. All of the jobs that I thought I probably had lined up were disappearing. Same for many of my colleagues at school. And so I very quickly went back into grad school, which is something I told myself I would never do without work experience. So long story short, when I started early on, I just wanted to work hard and apply myself and get in somewhere. And so I cast a fairly wide net to a number of companies in the financial services sector and ended up at an insurance company in my first role. And we can unpack a lot of that and go a bunch of different places, but I was just looking to get in and pay off debt and do something that was meaningful, that was exciting. I probably wouldn't say I was purpose driven, but I wanted to be intellectually challenged. I knew that.
But what's interesting is that you mentioned, and a lot of people do, of course, go back to grad school. So you said you mentioned you went to grad school on the heels of the recession and you never had work experience. So would you say that decision was more just based on trying to maximize your opportunities, or was there some deeper thought beyond that decision?
I'd like to say there was some master plan, but it was a bit more of a how the circumstances played out. Maybe let me just set the stage. In terms of background, I grew up in a pretty small but wonderful rural place in Ohio, K through 12, all in one building. I knew everyone in school, right? And there were some wonderful things about that community. Some of the other side of that coin was I wasn't exposed to a ton of quant type um, coursework, right? It was when you have that small of a school, the math courses probably ended at pre-calc, right? And so when I left high school and got into college, I didn't know what an actuary was, right? I didn't, and so when I met people at college who were already taking exams in year 3 and 4, that was astounding to me. So my whole approach in undergrad was I knew I wanted to be in business, perhaps in consulting. And so I thought about economics and a language, sort of a hard science with analytics within it, a lot of econometric work, as well as humanities. And my plan was to get out into the world and become either a consultant or an analyst in a large financial company. Then the recession hit, and grad school was honestly a way to continue building skills and furthering my marketability, but it wasn't my first choice. My first choice would have been to get work experience for 3 to 5 years, and then I was going to go back to get an MBA. The grad school I got into was at Penn State, great program. It was actually oriented towards becoming a foreign service officer, but I managed to get in late that summer and was fortunate enough to build a program that after I took the core curriculum, which I looked at as perfectly aligning with international business, right? It was about East-West contract law. It was about how business frameworks play out in different countries, how you think about markets and market forces, and how cultural and communications play into that. I was able to build sort of an international business degree and did that. But I will tell you, just my personal advice, if I could do it again, I would have done it after work experience. I was probably the only one in my class that didn't have real world experience. And so for me, it was still somewhat of an academic exercise versus the application of case study coming from. I had colleagues who had been practicing law for 5 years or worked for oil exploration companies and were into questions around rights in terms of where you drill and how you, and it was very, very, intimidating to me to see all these fully formed professionals coming back to add a skill set when I was still sort of reading textbooks.
Yeah, that's a great point on advice. Experience. Experience is always good to have when you're going into an MBA program or a grad program. Something that you mentioned, which is interesting, which I think it shows that you are very forward thinking, is we talked about your thoughts on work being cross-functional back then. When you would look 15, 20 years ahead, you thought that work would be cross-functional. And you even mentioned you went to grad school to develop skills, and you said you were focused on skills progression versus the hierarchical nature. And I think that's interesting because in the past, of course, you always just think of one level, then you get to the next. I certainly can speak from an actuarial perspective. Actuarial has always traditionally been very hierarchical based on exams and certain things. So what led you to develop that kind of non-conventional paradigm?
Yeah, it was it was probably two things. One, in undergrad, I was very drawn to economics. And economics is essentially, it's the study of, right, theoretically, it's the study of choice under scarcity. But any good economic theory starts with what is my model of how something works, whether it's the macro or the micro, right? And so it always starts with big picture context, what I call 360 thinking. Good economic theory does, right? That I think conditioned in me for 4, 5, 6 years to think about the world in terms of, before I jump into it, whatever it is, a problem, an opportunity, a job, what is the 360? And so that sort of led me to think about building skills in perhaps a different way. The second piece was when I got to my first employer, there were wonderful development programs, leadership development programs. They were typically structured around a vertical or a skill, perhaps operations, perhaps actuarial, as you know. And for some reason, I wasn't ready to jump into one of those. There were several that would have suited me. I actually will tell you, I had the first two actuarial exams. I had the books, the one on economics. I was like, that's where I will start. And I didn't pull the trigger because for some reason, felt it was too soon to specialize, which went against all of the conventional wisdom, right? We can talk about, the 80s and 90s, the consulting view that you should be a T-shaped leader and have depth in one place. And I certainly agree with depth, but I wasn't ready to pick a track. And so I remember talking to the head of a department at the time, asking, do you think it's possible to rotate cross-functionally? I would like to be more of a general manager. I need depth in a certain area, but to help me find what that area is, how would I think about structuring a career path? Is it possible to do a rotation in finance or a rotation in operations or a rotation in analytics? And then that led to a series of conversations around mentorship, and creating some of those opportunities. So that's sort of how I thought about it. And you're right. I had a belief that we were entering a phase of lifelong learning. And I honestly, I don't really know where that came from. Maybe it came from looking at my parents, who both had trades in the medical profession, right? And were constantly updating their skills, even in that trade. Maybe I saw that growing up and thought, you're constantly learning. But for some reason, I looked at a corporate career and said, I don't think I can pick a function for 40 years. I think I need to know multiple. And so I set out to see if that was possible. And I got lucky, and it has been. And it took a lot of help along the way to make it work out that way.
I think that was an excellent choice. And you talked about the idea of T-shaped. So something that kind of relates to what we just mentioned. One of the ways that you articulate your views on careers is seeing them as M-shaped versus T-shaped. So how would you describe that perspective?
Yeah, so I didn't come up with this. I wish I could. If I had coined it, I could probably trademark it and write a book. And Tim Brown was actually the CEO of IDEO. It was a design consulting firm in Palo Alto. In 1991, he's the first one who actually used the T-shaped skills term. And it was to describe someone who had depth in a certain specialization or field, but then, like the shape of a T, had branched off across horizontally into other areas, right? One of the big four consulting firms, who I shall not name here, don't want to give anyone special airtime, but they also talked about this in the 80s and 90s, that they wanted consultants who were T-shaped men, T-shaped women. So it's been around for a while. You may have heard it expressed as the adage, you don't want to be a mile wide and an inch deep. You need something that gives you your anchor, right? And I agree with that. And over my career, what I've started to think about is, how do you build multiple specializations, right? We can't go, as I say, we probably can't go back to the desk and say, I want to underwrite for 20 years, then I want to become an actuary, but you can bridge into other areas and develop competencies. And I think that's something that we have to do in today's world. I think, when I talk about M-shaped, just think of the shape of a T with the sides of the M dropping back down, right? So for me, I started in market research and product. I then branched into finance and got really deep in corporate finance, and investor relations for a few years. I had the chance to go into distribution. I had the chance to go into P&L management. And in each one of those, I looked at, what are the fundamentals and how do I get as deep as possible and build another specialization here? And I'm still doing that today. And I think, every one of us is probably facing this. Just look at some of the technological change that's occurring globally. We're all learning how to use new tools, data, analytics all of the time. So I don't see this trend abating, that you need to be functional in multiple areas while you still have an anchor really deep in at least one, if not two. It takes work to build it out, an application to do that. And I'll admit, it takes a little bit of discomfort. You have to be continuously curious, and you have to be willing to feel like you're onboarding for a long time in many ways, right? But I think there's a curiosity and a humility that comes with, constantly learning. And then once you get into that groove, I think it's fun. Truly, I just think it's fun to approach a new discipline or a function. It also puts you in the right headspace to constantly recognize someone in the room, many someone's in most rooms, right? Know more than you do. And so to have the humility to ask questions and learn from other people in every setting.
That's great. One of the things regarding the M shape, where you say you have expertise in several different areas, one of the points I find compelling that you mentioned before was you said that any good leader will tell you that they have to drop down and do the work to be an effective decision maker. And I think of it in terms of, like, one example is with actuaries, of course, data science. I mean, relative to our profession is fairly new. So you do have some actuaries who have gone into leading teams of people who may be data scientists or in advanced analytics. And sometimes it might be challenging to appropriately scope the work. So if you haven't built a model before, and you're managing someone who's doing that, what's the complexity? How long does it take to do? So I think that's an excellent point in terms of, being able to drop down and do the work. One question I want to ask on that, 'cause I feel like it can create a potential conflict in that when you're a manager, sometimes, like, I've been in situations, maybe just one situation in my career, I'd say, where you had a manager who, as I say, was like probably more player than coach. Because I think as a manager, one of your goals is to develop people. And sometimes if you're too deep in the weeds of the work, that can, somewhat interfere with your ability to do that. So any thoughts on that, kind of balancing that dynamic between being M-shaped, but,
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to try to draw from lessons I've learned from people who I consider to be wiser and more mature and better developed leaders than I am. But one person who I really respect has described it this way to me, right? You need to go deep enough to understand it and to be able to add a layer of value. And I think that's the line where you figure out, right, when you're talking about how deep do you go, there's a difference between micromanaging and understanding the inputs and the outputs and understanding the complexity and being informed and educated enough to help your team add a layer of value. And if you know where that line is, I think then that's how you're also able to know I can let someone run, or I can let a team run up until this point because I know they're capable of it. I know where the stretch line for them is, and then I know where I need to meet them and help, add some guidance and some direction. So I think that to me is the line, is how deep do you go to add a layer of value? You go too shallow and it's tough to do that. You go too deep and it feels like you're micromanaging. And on that point, I'll also say too, I think it's incumbent on us, all of us, right? Because I have a manager, I have leaders that I work with, right? We always will. It's incumbent upon all of us to understand that when our manager or someone more senior is dropping down in, it may not be to micromanage, right? Or it may not be them losing sight of the player coach. They may also be trying to grasp it, to get the situation, to learn as well. If we're asking everyone to be curious and lifelong learners, we have to recognize people need to do that who are above us as well. And so I think it takes the pressure off of feeling like, do they doubt me? Am I being micromanaged? Not necessarily. They may just be wanting to learn so they can find where is the layer of value they want to add. And they may also be trying to triangulate. I've seen many situations like this before. Do I shorthand it? Is my pattern recognition accurate here? Or is there something different about this? Let me hear from my team and listen and learn and be open and sort of figure out, if this is something I can help with immediately, or if it's something that has evolved since I sat at the desk and did it myself. I think all of that plays out into finding that line.
I think that's a great analogy, adding that layer of value. And I certainly, from my career, I can think of some of the most successful leaders I've seen. It's almost like an optimization problem. Like you said, they have to be able to drop down a bit, but not too deep. You have some leaders I've seen, certainly they're out there in meetings all day, but if you show them an exhibit, they can easily look at the number and know, okay, is this reasonable or not, without even doing the analysis. And I think it sounds like that's in alignment with what you're saying, is being able to, recognize things beyond to a certain degree, at least.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that you've in your career, you've been fortunate to get advice from many different leaders, many different successful leaders in different areas. So what is some of the best advice you've received in your career?
Yeah, this is the fun part. Let's pass it forward, and I owe a debt of gratitude to several people. Maybe I'll share a couple. One was early on. I personally, right? I think like many of us, I was probably pretty focused on the structuring the perfect career. How do I do that, right? And that sort of leaves you in a place of thinking mentally. Every decision I make is critical, right? And someone helped disabuse me gently of that notion and said, look, a career is more like branches on a tree, and there's a bunch of different ways to get a bunch of different directions. Some decisions you make open up new branches, some decisions may close off certain branches. So one of the great pieces of advice I got early on was when I was thinking about what role do I take next, or what skills do I want to develop, rather than thinking about how does this all, where does this all go in 20 or 30 years, a mentor said to me, just map out the next 5 to 10 and pick two big contrasting directions, right? So at that time, I was probably in a finance role, and someone said, do you want to run a P&L or do you want to run a function? And I said, oh, P&L. I had an immediate, and so they said, well, great. Then think about a set of skills or opportunities or roles that will take you more that direction, right? If you want to run a function, maybe go get a CPA and go down the finance path. So picking two options and plotting them out and saying, which one do I have a gut reaction to? Which one do I gravitate towards? And then picking skills or roles that align to that. I found that immensely helpful. And I've done it over and over. And like a good economist, I usually plot it on an XY graph. And I pick two things that feel sort of on opposite ends of the spectrum. And rather than trying to pick a perfect move, I pick directionally towards those. I think a second piece of really good advice was this came from an actuarial mentor. I had a mentor who told me that this was in response to me saying I probably wanted to run a business one day, or that's what I thought, right? So, and we'll come back to that lesson, because I think another piece of advice is be clear in what you want so your mentors can help you. But I had an actuarial leader who I have always respected. His EQ and his IQ were both extremely high. He said, you want 4 experiences in a career. You want to start something up and know what that feels like to build it. You want to have to shut something down, know what it's like to know when an idea or a market or a product isn't viable, something in more of a runoff phase. You want a turnaround experience, right? Take something that isn't working and put in the sweat equity with a team of people to figure out how to get it to work. And then you want to take steady state and make it better. And his counsel to me was, it's really easy to just do steady state and make it better over and over and over. It's quite comfortable and maybe a little safe to say, I'll take this role, it's established, I need to do it really well, right? So I found that advice to be incredibly helpful, and it's helped me sort of determine at certain points in my career, let's take something that may be a new experience, right, and round me out in a new way. So I've thought about that a lot. And then maybe the last one I'll share is when you are talking to mentors, to sponsors, to people in your network, being clear with what your objectives are is important. Listening more than you speak is important. And then determining what advice is for you and what advice is just from their personal perspective and they're sharing it. And so I didn't know what that person meant when they said it, but then a couple times I got some advice and thought, that's interesting. That's someone's experience. It may not apply to me. So move on to the next thing I can learn from. And I don't mean that to be dismissive. I mean, I tell that to people when I mentor them as well. This is my perspective. This is what I've been through. Here's how you might think about it. But you have to contextualize the advice you get to your specific situation. And so the best way to get good input from a mentor or sponsor is to be clear and help them understand what your objectives are and what it is you're looking, to do next in your career or from the relationship. So those were three pretty helpful pieces of advice.
Those are three good ones. I just have a quick follow-up, maybe not getting
Yeah.
too deep, but regarding the four experiences, because you correctly pointed out, well, based on what the person said, it seems from my perspective that in larger companies, that steady state experience appears to dominate or predominate. So if you're in that environment and you find that some of those experiences, like you said, starting something up, which might be a bit more rare, any ideas on how you might be able to identify some of those?
Yeah, fair question. And I think I should say as well, there is a lot to be said, again, because the only way to build the T-shaped depth that we've talked about needing, or multiple legs of the T to make an M, is you do have to stick with something for a while. You do have to build depth in something and move through a discipline or a function. So I don't want to discount that at all, right? The advice was make sure you get more than that over the span of a career. But in terms of the startup, I asked the same question. I said, well, are you telling me I have to be at the right place, right time to start a product, right? Or a new market? And the response I got was, no, it could be starting up a number of things. It could be joining a team that is small or a discipline that is emerging and taking a bet on this has limited visibility or impact in the organization today or the profession today. I'm going to go get deep here and see if I can learn something and help build this out, because I believe there's value in it. So there's a specific role I have in mind a number of years ago at a prior employer where we were really good at a bunch of things. We weren't necessarily great at a certain discipline. I won't name what it was, but there was a chance to sort of help build that out into something akin to a practice. And I raised my hand and took a shot at that role, and it could have failed, and it sort of, I had to say no to a couple other opportunities, but that was an opportunity to run at something and help think through, how do I build an organizational capability and mature it here, and then help scale it back into the broader organization. So that was an example of something that I started up, right? No one had done it before me. And it just sort of took a little bit of luck, took a little bit of people looking out for me, but it also took the willingness to say, I'll go do that, right? Versus take perhaps a more established role as my next path. I think same thing on, it's harder to find maybe shutting things down, but same thing on turnarounds, right? Sometimes a turnaround is simply jumping into something where we say, we're in the market, we're in the product, we're in the discipline, whatever it may be, and we could be a lot better at it. Sometimes that's a fun place to be, an environment where everyone agrees in the organization, there's opportunity here, right? Sometimes you want to look for those opportunities. Versus saying this is the spot that is churning out the right growth, the right profitability, right? Sometimes it's easier to learn, because if you go to the spot where we say we haven't quite cracked the code, there's usually more opportunity in some of those spots. So again, that's how I was coached to think about it. It's been quite helpful.
Great insights there. Now, you mentioned several times, I'm excited to get into this, mentors and sponsors, who I imagine had an impact on your career and continue to. So mentorship and sponsorship, they're both important for career progression, but they are different. So how would you describe the difference between the two, mentorship and sponsorship?
Yeah, so my short answer, right? In plain English, I think a mentor is someone who helps hold the mirror up for you in a safe space, right? And that can be letting you think through problems and ask questions. It could be strategizing, it could be guidance, but I think of it more as the safe space where you, at least for me, you're learning, you're being vulnerable, you're asking questions, you're acquiring information, you're seeking input and wisdom and counsel. I think a sponsor is someone who goes to bat for you when you're not in the room, right? Maybe creates opportunities that you weren't aware of, is is thinking about how to develop you and round you out. And I think a mentor can turn into a sponsor. But I think that's the difference I see between the two. One is creating a space for you and saying, what is it you need from me in this context? Another is committed to going to bat for you and furthering your opportunities.
No, similar to what you said in the beginning of the episode, you mentioned that you're passionate about career development. I honestly am passionate about this very subset, I guess, of career development. And I remember it came to my attention when I watched a TED Talk on it, where the person talked about not having seen any evaluative processes that didn't involve someone else's opinion and something related to relationships. So I think the idea of sponsorship and not just mentorship is really important. And certainly from my experience, the companies I've been at, there's been a disproportionate emphasis on mentorship, and the sponsorship is honestly something I just had to figure out on my own. I might have heard the name in passing, but I don't think it's something that, at least from my experience, I've seen a lot of companies push on. So from a sponsorship perspective, it sounds like that has been beneficial in your career. So how have you benefited from sponsorship in your career?
Let me maybe just take a moment to comment on part of what you just said there. So I think mentorship versus sponsorship, right? Any company I've been, right, there are cultural elements to that, but I think there's again, let me share some advice I got early on. When I asked around how do you find a sponsor, right? I had a really, really great manager who said, well, you start by finding mentors and building a network. And if you build a rich one, right, some of those mentors can become sponsors. I think it's pretty tough to walk out and say, hi, I'd like a sponsor, right? Because a sponsor is someone who, if they're putting their political capital, right, and if they're going to bat for you, they need to know you well enough to know what your strengths are and then what your needed development opportunities are, right? And so I think that's something that, to your point, it sometimes can feel maybe mysterious of how do you get that? In my case, I was coached to ask for it, and I was coached to start with finding a couple key mentors, right, based on specifically what is it you're looking to learn or think about. So in my case, early in my career, I asked for a mentor in a specific discipline of the company, and I asked for a mentor who had done different functional accountabilities. I went to my manager and said, could you help me find someone like this? The reason I'm asking is I'd like to have career conversations with someone who has jumped across functions like I might like to do, but I'd like to do that in a safe space. I basically told my manager, I don't want to ask you these questions and have you think that I'm trying to jump out of the department. I'm very happy where I am, right? That person graciously thought about it for a few weeks, said, okay, tell me where you want to go, tell me what you're looking to learn. Then they went and approached 2 or 3 people on my behalf and said, would you be interested in a mentorship relationship? 2 of them said yes. It was quite structured in terms of they asked that I take it seriously, that I send them a short list, once a quarter, a week ahead before we met, of here's what I've done since we last spoke to act on what we talked about last time. Here's what I'd like to talk about this time. And through those mentorship relationships, those eventually became sponsorship relationships. And then I want to add one more point here, because I think a lot of conversations when we're early in career start out with, well, how do I do that? Or how do I build that? I think the other part of it is, if you take a longer term view, many of the people in your current network, even lateral or peers, they may become your sponsors down the road. If you go back to the definition of a sponsor, can be someone who's advocating for you or on your behalf when an opportunity comes along you may not be aware of. That network, day one, 5 years later, some of those people will be at different places in the company or the organization or the globe, right? So building a broad network, that's like sowing seeds in a field, and that grows up over time. And many of those peer-to-peer and mentor relationships become sponsors. So I would not discount that early on, and I would not discount what comes from patience. That's my long-winded way of getting back to your specific question, then, which was how have I benefited? There have been a couple moments in my career where a sponsor came to me and said, I've been thinking about our conversations for the last 12 to 18 months. I know you've aspired to do X, Y, or Z. I think your next move, though, should be here, right? There's an opportunity I'm aware of. Perhaps they sit, somewhere else in the organization. And I've been coached a few times to apply for things that I never would have thought of, right? I don't think sponsorship is someone saying, I got you a job, right? You start you start Tuesday. I think that's what sponsorship has looked like for me, is the gentle nudge where I thought I was going right, right, and someone said, you should go left here, right? Because this market could develop dramatically, or this function could develop dramatically, or we're going to put strategic importance on this opportunity. You have a chance to get in and be part of a team early and see what that turns into. And there's probably 2 or 3 moments in my career where that happened. I never would have thought about it or known about it had a sponsor not made me aware of, this is where you should look next. I think that's what it's looked like for me. And that's what I try then to pay forward to people that I, sponsor. And that can include corporate America. That can also include outside of corporate America. But I think that's, when I think back on it, that has been the biggest impact of sponsorship for me. Mm-hmm. And then there's also, there's 1 or 2 instances where someone, will speak on your behalf. I know that has happened. I can't speak to how it happened, right? But I'm certain there have been times where people were looking out for my next opportunity and said, we should consider Kellen for this role because it will develop him out, right? And I've certainly done that for others and said, this is the right move for this person, given how we want to develop them. I think that's what it looks like, but I don't think it's a shortcut. There's not this, you get handed a job. That's just not how I've personally seen it play out.
Yeah, there's a few things I love with your response. The first thing is that it's a longer term play or a longer term commitment, given that someone is putting their reputational capital at stake.
Right.
And another thing is that you have to be intentional in expressing what you're seeking to get out of, whether it's a mentorship relationship, your career. And then the third point, another point you made on networking, which I think is great. I've certainly seen it in my career where when you build a strong enough network, our opportunities can develop organically without you even seeking them out. So
that's right.
Wholeheartedly champion that message.
Let me add 1 quick thought too, Dominic, is sometimes sponsorship is not a sponsor getting you even the opportunity or pointing out a job. Sometimes it's skills-based or project-based. So there's been a couple moments in my career where I said, I really want to get closer to XYZ, where I've never done, and they become aware of, there's a cross-functional project happening in this market, or this, you should get involved in that, and they open that door. And then that gives you the chance to show, this is what I can do with the opportunity, right? That may be what sponsorship looks like as well, is pointing out, here's a way to acquire the next skill you want. Here's a way to get an experience you need. And then that makes you ready as a candidate for the next job you're looking for. And that's a really powerful way to ask for and use sponsorship, because it doesn't require budgeting or organizational lines or anything like that changing. It's just about plugging you into work that is happening in the organization.
Great. Now, this next one is actually really important, and I think one of the most relatable questions. Regardless of what function you're in, what industry you're in, at some point, employees aspire to be promoted for the good work that they're doing, or for the aspirations. And they have aspirations which that would help with. And of course, you've navigated several different promotions. Of course, you have teams. I'm sure you've led teams, or you've been involved in those decisions and discussions in various capacities. So what guidance do you have for employees and individuals who aspire to be promoted?
Fair question. I figured it was coming at some point. Yeah, we're all human, right? We all want to be rewarded for the skills that we have and the value that we bring. And a promotion or a raise feels great. I fully understand that, and I'm human like the rest of us. I'm going to go back in the theme of the whole conversation to the advice I was given that has sort of shaped how I've thought about this the last 15 years. My very first development plan with a manager early on, right on the top of the page, I said, goals for the year, get promoted to senior analyst, right? And this manager was just such a deft touch, such a gracious touch, and said, okay, if that's what you want, probably not best to lead with it, probably best to lead with what would it look like in terms of me, skill sets, experiences, competencies, where you would say, I would bring that level of value to the organization. And if that position opened up or a promotion was available, I'd be ready for it across the board. I'd tick every box. And that completely shifted my mindset from the goal is get promoted to the goal is skills development, experience development, and understanding what does it look like to be successful at the next level. So that's the first piece I suggest is it's you should be clear in your goals. Don't be ashamed to advocate for yourself. Don't feel bad about saying I would like this, but then quickly follow it up with I would like that, and I recognize that I need to have a certain set of skills, experiences, competencies. Can we talk about what that looks like, where I currently am, and where I should focus my development efforts? That's a really powerful way to have that conversation, because then a manager or a mentor or a sponsor can say, great, I see you here, here, and here, and the next role requires competencies that you don't have here and here. Let's begin developing those and have very clear ongoing conversations throughout the year and track your progress and give you those at-bats and those repetitions. I think the second thing, if I can expand on this one a little bit, I got 4 of them. Be really clear that, and again, this came from a mentor. What makes you successful at one level may not be the same things that make you successful at the next level. You alluded earlier, when you jump from individual contributor to leading a team, the game changes in some really simple ways. But as an example, it goes from accuracy, output, value, independent contributorship to can I understand how to help develop people and make the sum of the parts greater than the whole, right? Those are different skill sets. And so it's I think an important part of the conversation with your manager and for you to be eyes wide open of what does good look like? What does competency look like at the next level? Because there are skills-based competencies that we should have at every role. I think related to that, number 3 is understand that as you move up in your career and you're accountable for other people, their development, you're accountable for broader parts of the company in terms of contributions and value and stewardship of resources, right? EQ versus IQ. It sounds so simple, but the EQ piece becomes increasingly important, and knowing where, when, and how to focus the power of your IQ, right? And then the last thing I'll say is followership. And this was another one that was pointed out to me. I didn't come with this thought fully formed in my head when I started working. I remember the mentor who said it to me, which was there are certain points in your career where when you're being evaluated for a promotion, right, the organization is looking at you to understand if we put this person in the next role, if we put them in charge of a team, if we put them, right, whatever it may be, what followership will they have? Will their peers look at that person and say, there's the blend of EQ and IQ, there's the self-awareness, there's a well-rounded leader across leading others, leading self, right? And followership becomes an important part about how, how the organization will respond to an opportunity that may be put in front of you. So I thought those were 4 really good pieces that you can sort of, look at and think about. And the outcome of all of them is they lead to really productive conversations around skills and competencies that you need to develop. And I think that's the best way to have a conversation around how do I advocate for myself and move up? Be very clear in the skills and competencies that you need, that you're requiring, and how those then deliver value to the organization.
I had a follow up on, I want to drill just a little bit deeper, specifically on competencies. I know when previously spoke, you mentioned a few categories. You mentioned individual contributor, direct/indirect influence, and then execution/impact. So any thoughts on those three categories of competencies?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different ways to cut this, right? You can talk about leading self, leading others, leading business. You can talk about execution versus professional development versus personal. You know, there's a bunch of different grids, but one that has stuck with me is the competencies that it takes to lead for business outcomes, which can often be execution focused, setting a vision, rallying people and resources around the vision. The competencies that it takes for leading others, especially when you're in an indirect position or a lateral position or an influence position, right? I made this mistake early on in my career saying, I really want to practice my leadership skills. I need to manage a team. And I had a wonderful mentor and counselor who said, you actually need to practice your influence skills. It's easy to wield authority, right? It's really easy to do it poorly as well. You don't want to be the kind of leader that says there's a hierarchy, right? And here's where I sit. You want to be able to build strategic alliances and phantom farm and give away ideas and be a battery for other people and find out, you know, what makes them tick and what they're thinking and draw them into a conversation and partner together. And there's a specific set of skill sets around how you make those connections with people and how they feel heard, how they feel valued, how they feel like you're bringing something to the table and together you're making a better product. That's a powerful way to influence. And I think if I could coach my younger self, I would say focus more on those skills even earlier on. That's actually, again, it feeds back into the followership. It feeds into how you're viewed graciously as a person. So don't mistake leadership with direct authority or reporting lines. There's a whole set of competencies around what it means to influence and work together. And then there's leading self, right? And you really get into some of the EQ here, but your awareness, right? Both of your strengths and your blind spots, your situational awareness, your empathy, awareness of how you show up as a leader. I'm a big fan of things like whether it's Myers-Briggs or DISC or there's a few others, strength finders, right? Knowing what you lean into as a person, whether you're leading or not, right? What are my competencies? How do I operate when I'm stressed, when I'm not stressed, right? Knowing those about yourself and then understanding everyone else around you is a different blend of their own skill sets. And you have to figure out, it is incumbent on you, right? When we talk about people's perception is your reality, it is incumbent upon you to understand your strengths and blind spots and how others perceive those and interact with you, and be aware of, you know, the way you use your strengths and the way you watch out for your blind spots. So just a couple of thoughts there on how you think about that. And that's lifelong. It's rich, it's deep, it's broad, but that is a lifelong conversation. And we're all constantly working on that. We should be.
Yeah. So just to do a quick lightning round, you talked a little bit about strength finders and Myers-Briggs, and I think that has a lot to do with awareness. Now, regarding what are some personal development habits that you've cultivated in your career that you've found to be helpful?
Yeah, couple things come to mind. One is, took me a while to learn this, but knowing yourself and how you work and when your creative moments are, and protecting those times, right? So if you're a morning person and that's when creativity hits, lean into that, structure your day that way. If you're a night owl and that's when it hits, lean into that, right? So I intentionally manage as best I can my calendar around knowing when those moments are for me, because once you get into the day, right, you never know where the day's going to go. So just carving out those moments for yourself to work best the way you work. I think another is knowing how to say no to certain things, knowing what you're saying yes to, knowing what you're saying no to. Early in career, I think sometimes it can be tempting to think we have to say yes to everything. That's how these opportunities unfold. And sometimes it's about knowing, I want this, I want that opportunity, I want this skill set, this project. And so you have to have the time to do a couple things really well and make the most of those. And this was one I struggled with for a while, and I still battle sometimes. On the personal side, I read every night. I usually have 5 or 6 books going at once. Sometimes they're for planes, sometimes they're my nighttime books, sometimes I'm reading academically, but they're usually from pretty different cuts of the world than what I do for a living. So I'll read memoirs, I'll read science fiction, science, I'll read medical. I've got a bunch of different stuff going right now, but I find that reading about different areas, it's a scope expander. It's a horizon expander. It takes your eyes off of what you're so fixed on during the day. And sometimes it's just the act of reading that book where the answer to something that's been nagging you rushes back in unexpectedly, right? Because you freed yourself from the point on the horizon you've been so focused on. And then the last one is, I have really come to love sleep the older I've got. And I was never a great sleeper. I'm a type A, and so it's pretty easy for me to let my mind ruminate overnight and solve problems. So 2 things to help with that. One is I've begun journaling. I journal, what's most important for tomorrow. Sometimes I gratitude journal. There's a lot of studies showing it's almost impossible, truly impossible, to hold stress or anxiety when you're expressing deeply gratitude, something you're grateful for. Didn't quite make sense to me until a few years ago, and I picked it up at the suggestion of a friend. So that's a great way to sort of let go of certain things at the end of a long day. And the last one is I do a 3-2-1 schedule at night. 3 hours before I want to sleep, I stop eating. 2 hours before I want to sleep, I stop drinking any liquids. And an hour before bed, I turn off all screens, including the laptops, the phones, the iPads, which can be a little bit scary, but sometimes I will actually, put them physically in a different place. And I read a physical book as the last thing I do. And I've created a very intentional routine around how I wind down, create some self-care, and create a sleep routine that works for me. So there you go.
Well, thank you so much, Kellen. I learned so much, and I'm looking forward to sharing this with the community. So thank you so much for your time, and let's definitely, as always, keep in touch.
My pleasure. And again, Dominic, thank you for having me. Thank you for the platform and the work that you're doing. And as you said, hopefully this is helpful for someone out there in terms of tips and tricks and ways to think about, navigating a career. And I'll just close by saying, thank you to all those I've had the privilege from working with, learning from. Thank you to my own mentors and sponsors, and let's all keep paying it forward in the ways that we can.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.